Welcome to SafeR Journeys, a podcast dedicated to raising children, ending violence, and ending oppression. We are your hosts. I'm Melissa, the Community Engagement Director, and over the prevention programming with Safe Journeys.
Yeah, and I am one of her employees.
Which I love my staff so much, and so it's just such a joy to be on a podcast with Heather.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I'm Heather. I'm one of Melissa's preventionists. You'll hear me say this almost every time. You can call me whatever you want. Community educator, call me a preventionist, call me community engagement specialist. I'm doing the same thing no matter what the title is. All right, so right off the bat, let's start with a trigger warning. As usual, there may be some discussion about sexual and domestic violence in this podcast or this episode. If you need to stop listening, come back later, get yourself a tea or coffee, do whatever you need to do to make yourself feel safe and comfortable if you're going to listen to this episode. Otherwise, you don't have to listen. Melissa and I will never, ever know.
That is true. And take care of yourself after this episode as well, if you do get through it.
Yeah, totally. So we are going to be talking again about LGBTQ plus youth. And we're going to be focusing still on like what the current climate is. And Melissa's going to start us off. She's going to talk to us all about what the mental health landscape looks like for young people that are LGBTQ plus.
Right. And as always, we are working with data, like the most current data that we can get our hands on. And so this comes from the Human Rights Campaign and the University of Connecticut's LGBTQ plus youth survey from 2018, that almost all of the LGBTQ plus young people that responded to this survey had trouble sleeping at night. Yeah. And that's 95%.
It makes me so sad. Like, there are so many things that kids are dealing with right now. And adding this in about their own identity and how they see themselves, of course, it's keeping them up at night, running through their brain.
And just thinking about the extra stresses that they have to face on a daily basis and how that impacts sleep and mental health and education and like being able to, whether it's education or if they have a job or any of their extracurriculars or just how they view themselves, this is going to impact them on a physical and mental level. Yeah. And it is heartbreaking to think about the extra load they bear when they are operating in the world.
Yeah, it bums me out. I know the things I sit up at night and think about, and I just wish that young people didn't have to sit up and think about and stress about things the way that some of us adults do.
Right, exactly. Like, kids shouldn't have to bear those burdens. Yeah. And it's just so sad because, like, those are the burdens that society, like the people around them are putting on them. Like, this doesn't have to be like this.
No, it doesn't. It doesn't have to be that way.
No.
Yeah.
And unsurprisingly, LGBTQ young people also feel more stressed than their cisgendered heterosexual peers. In other words, too, I wanted to start with some vocabulary if we do drop some things.
Yes.
So,
and we'll go through them more in depth in the next episode. But just so you're not listening going, what the heck is that?
And when I said cisgendered heterosexual, sometimes people will hear that as cishet. And so cisgendered just means that you are on the gender spectrum of like that you typically hear about, right? Like you're not non-binary, you're not trans, you are in this typical binary of like female or male.
Yeah, one under the other kind of thing.
Right. Yeah. And then heterosexual is more about sexual orientation.
Yeah, who you're romantically and sexually interested in. Can I tell you just like the quickest funny story?
Yes.
When I saw cishet written for the first time, it did not have a slash in it. It was just CISHET, and I was like, what the heck is cishet? Like it sounded like some sort of dainty something. I don't know what. I was like, it took me much longer than I'd like to admit.
Is
to
it
feel
British?
I know. I was like, is it fancy?
Yes, it sounds fancy.
But yeah, no, just a funny story. Like, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm sure you're not alone in that. I think like the first time I started, I saw that term as well. I was like, I don't know what this is, you know? And that's the thing. It's like this is a whole nother like dictionary.
Yeah.
Like of vocabulary words for you, because this is just a different population's experience, and and we all have a gender identity. We all have a sexual orientation. It's just so interesting that like these vocabulary words are not mainstream. I think they're getting better.
Totally.
But I think there's also people who say like, no, that's not even a thing. And so I think it's harder to use with some groups.
And I think young people specifically are more willing to adopt the terminology.
Yeah.
Because I really feel like I hear these things more from young people than from adults. Like even like hardcore allies. Sometimes there's these terms that the young people are using more frequently.
Yeah. And I know young people also, like, once they hear adults using a term, they're like, we got to figure out a different term.
Yes.
And I think that is used in this as well.
Yep.
Like, as they're exploring themselves and figuring stuff out. I also think, like, because they have the space to explore and accessibility to resources like the internet to connect with other people who are experiencing similar things, they're able to identify it more and maybe name it, or if they're the first one to name it, then they get to do that, and that is beautiful as well.
That's powerful for sure.
And this is actually from 2021, and this is the CDC's Youth Risk Behavior Survey, and this is a nationwide survey, and it found that LGBTQ plus youth experience a lot more depression, feelings of hopelessness, poor mental health, and more suicide attempts than their straight cisgender peers.
I think I would wish I was surprised.
I know.
I'm not. Particularly because of the first two things we mentioned, right? Yeah. That they're having trouble sleeping and that they're more stress. They have more stress. So of course that's going to be hopelessness, poor mental health. I actually was looking at this data in charts, like in graphs, and it felt even worse when I could see the veering off of, like their cisgender heteronormative peers, where they're at for their hopelessness levels. And then comparing that to the youth that identify as LGBTQ plus is heartbreaking when you see just the change and the difference. Yeah. Visualizing it is really important for me when I look at data. Visualization is really helpful.
I think it would help anybody, and especially if, we're talking with boards of education or other committees or groups. I think it's powerful to have that data and the visual representation in front of them so they can really understand, like, no, this is a problem. It might not sound like a problem when I'm saying it this way, but if you look at the numbers and what exactly they're dealing with, let's make this real for you.
Yeah. And that I love the comparison too, right? Because it's gonna be hard for us to understand how they're different if we don't have the comparison.
Right.
And if you all out there want to look at these visualizations or these visual graphs, you can do that. The CDC website, just look for the Youth Risk Behavioral Survey. It's usually abbreviated YRBS. Is it two S's?
I think it's just one.
Okay, YRBS. But yeah, you can look at it up on the CDC and kind of pick what you want to visualize as well and play with it. It's really helpful, at least for me. If you're a teacher, if you're someone who's around a lot of young people, take a peek. Quick peek. Shouldn't take you too long. Although, if you're like me, you might get stuck looking 2 hours later. You've created an accidental presentation. All right. So another thing that I believe adds into this increased stress and difficulty sleeping, hopelessness, suicide attempts, etc., is that these young people are experiencing more violence than their cis het peers as well. So I also want to say, I'm going to talk about bullying. When I say bullying, I want everyone to be thinking about not just like the traditional at school bullying. This can be over the cell phone. This can be over the internet. We just have new ways now, unfortunately, to hurt people. So when I talk about bullying, remember it's also cyberbullying. And so, as you might imagine, I'm going to talk about how LGBTQ youth are bullied more. That youth risk behavioral survey, it said 1 in 4 LGBTQ young people will experience bullying. I hate that people are picked on everywhere they go for being their authentic selves. That feels terrible. I can't imagine what that would be like walking around as a young person specifically, because you're already insecure. Right. You already have all these other new identities forming, and now you have to add this additional layer.
Yeah, and it's interesting to think about this too, because, as an LGBTQ youth, you have quite a few vulnerabilities going on. Not only are you young, you are, a various gender identity or sexual orientation, and you may or may not be experiencing bullying. However, experiencing bullying. So this is something they're dealing with all the time. And they could be experiencing microaggressions is what I'm trying to get at.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
And then you have the bullying, which if they are experiencing bullying, it may or may not stop after school, like you said, with the online. Yeah. And this follows them. And this is with bullying in general now. But I just think about the extra pile on because they're dealing with microaggressions and things like that all the time. Yep. Because who they are doesn't go away, no matter where they are. And then you got the bullying on top of that. I'm
having social anxiety thinking about it.
Yeah. Yeah. That's what I just kept thinking about, the pile on.
Yeah. I wouldn't want to leave the house. I wouldn't want to interact with anybody.
Yeah.
Because it might cause me pain at multiple instances during that day. Yeah. It's terribly distressing to think about that.
It is. And I think LGBTQ young people are so brave.
I agree.
To be out.
I agree.
I really do.
I agree. I love seeing that. I love when they're like, nope, this is me. You're going to get on board or you're not going to be a part of my life.
Yeah.
I love that for them. That they're holding such good boundaries at such a young age and saying your behavior is unacceptable.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to be a part of that.
Yeah. And I also think it's brave to make the decision. It's like a safety planning decision where they may not be able to be out to their family because they know that they will be kicked out or treated differently or whatever it is. Yep. And so then those are extra things they'd have to deal with. That more deal with the survival, because then they don't have the protection of shelter and their parents. Right. And so I just, that could be a brave decision too.
Oh, absolutely.
So it's just, but think about it, they're having to deal with these decisions of how to handle this. And is it okay for me to share who I am? And it's heartbreaking to not share with the people that are your family, whoever that is.
Yeah, yeah.
Who you are.
I think about how I navigate in between different spaces in my professional sense versus my personal sense, right? And because I work with the community, it can be a little blurry sometimes what's professional and what is just me being myself.
Yes.
And it is hard for me to remember, what space am I in? How am I presenting myself today?
Yes.
And I only can imagine it's that times a zillion.
Yeah.
When you're an LGBTQIA person and it's well, at school I'm okay to be out, but at home I'm not. And doing that code switching.
Yes. And that's something we're going to be talking about in the next episode as well. But I just wanted to mention it quickly, is that this is something for educators and other caregivers to be aware of. If you are a safe person for an LGBTQ youth and they come out to you and they share maybe their preferred name or their real name to themselves, and they may not be using it at home, and like to make sure you follow their lead on when you can use their name and when you can't.
Yeah, absolutely. Their name or their pronouns or whatever.
Exactly. Yeah.
So yes, absolutely. And you're right. We're going to do kind of 2-ish episodes about being the best ally you can be.
Yes.
So in addition to experiencing more bullying, there is a lot more experiences of sexual assault, sexual harassment, and they experience more dating violence as well. And all of this kind of ties into that persecution and using sexual violence, domestic violence as a tool to hurt and oppress individuals.
Right.
Specifically in this case, individuals that are LGBTQ.
Right. Because they have more vulnerabilities. So it is easier for perpetrators and oppressors to abuse power and control over them.
Yep, sure is. And in that vein, if you will, I want to mention fatal violence. Fatal violence, meaning violence to the degree that someone is murdered against trans individuals, happens quite a bit, an alarming amount. And it specifically happens to individuals with additional layers of marginalization. So, for instance, trans women of color that are under the age of 35 make up more than 50% of trans folks that have been murdered. So half of all the trans folks that we're looking at in whatever study, half of them are specifically trans women of color. So Black trans women.
Under 35.
Under 35. Yep. And it makes me... I remember being little, and so my stepdad was a firefighter in a big city. And, in the 90s or so, people would drop off transgender folks that were doing sex work at the firehouse for care after they had been severely physically abused or beaten because they couldn't go to the hospitals. They weren't going to get the care that they needed, but they had their paramedics at the firehouse who could help patch them up.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. Just, it's terrible. I remember hearing that and being like, why the heck would they beat somebody up and drop them at your door? That sounds that sounds weird.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I didn't know the nuance at the time, but now I do. Yeah.
I'm so glad to hear that the firefighters and the paramedics patched them up.
Yes. Yeah. Yeah.
And didn't withhold medical care.
No, they would
that.
never. They would never.
Yeah.
I'm grateful that that's my my family member. My dad is someone who's going to be going out and helping people regardless.
Yeah.
Of their gender identity, what color they are. It's just like, no, our job is to help people be safe.
That's right.
Period.
That's how it
animals
should be.
Truly,
always.
right?
Yeah.
But yeah, that's how it should be. And people shouldn't have to be afraid to go to the hospital.
No.
I mean, and there were multiple layers because they were also sex workers. They didn't want the police to, all of those kinds of things.
Right.
But, yeah.
But then you think, so, in the past couple episodes, we've been talking about oppression and, the systemic issue of that is like, were these, trans women of color able to get, professional jobs or anything like that? No, they were doing what they had to do to make the money to put food on the table.
Yep.
And that, that's the systemic injustice that we're talking about.
Yeah, and sex work does not have medical insurance, right?
Right.
And it's illegal at least in our state.
Right.
So they don't have a choice. I was going to say they get subpar care. It's not necessarily subpar care. It's just they don't have the equipment and resources that a hospital. They're not taking x-rays, right?
Right.
They're going to help them get bandaged up, clean up any wounds they might have, and assess them.
Right.
But yeah, gosh.
So it's truly discrimination is at the root of that systemic issue.
Absolutely.
There. Yeah. Oh. Oh, and like we said, there are just so many layers upon layers of issues here, and us naming, what LGBTQ youth are experiencing right now. That's just like the surface. That's us saying this is the state of what's happening.
Yeah.
But it's due to these underlying factors.
Yes.
Rooted in oppression.
Absolutely.
So there are other increased risks for LGBTQ youth. They are more likely to run away or become homeless. And as I was saying about like not really knowing what the home situation is like for a young person who maybe comes out to you because you're a safe person in their life, their home situation could be that they've been kicked out of their home because of their identity. Maybe they leave because of the discrimination or abuse after coming out. Like I said, like some kind of retribution or punishment for them saying who they are.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I used to work with runaway homeless youth, and a significant portion of my clients were LGBTQIA+. And their stories varied from I left because I was being treated poorly because I had come out, or I was unable to come out, and that was detrimental to me, so I had to leave that space. Or their parents said, absolutely not, you can't live in our house or our home, or we're not going to support you if that's, who you are.
Right.
So there's a variety of reasons that they might not be at home anymore. Do you remember that? Were you at the one presentation where we were talking about like healthy and unhealthy behaviors, and that one young trans person said like, well, what about my parents that, talk about me being trans negatively?
Yes.
That's an unhealthy behavior. And I was like,
yes.
Yeah, 100% that's an unhealthy behavior.
That's right. Yes.
But it was so sad. Like, oh, I hate hearing it. And then like, what do I do, Heather? I don't know.
Yeah.
I wish I could force your parents to change their opinion, but I can't.
Yeah.
Like, I can offer you support groups or other adults that might be supportive, but I can't change your parents.
Yeah.
They can't change their parents.
No, and a lot of them are trying to educate their parents, and I know the parents are doing what they can. At least some of them are, and like the young person still has to come alongside their caregiver and say, oh no, that this is what it is, or whatever. And at least there's a humility there with the caregiver, and that's an open conversation happening. I think that's very healthy to be happening. I do hear the frustration from the young people, like, yeah, it takes me time, but like so does every relationship. Sure. And people might not understand yet. And it's okay to have that conversation going, like we don't expect perfection. But I think young people, like, again, that's another load for them mentally, just to keep that in mind. Now, that doesn't mean that like you shouldn't do your homework and everything, but I think just keeping in mind the load on our LGBTQ youth. I mean,
they expect their parents to be doing that homework.
They do, which I want them to expect 100%. That.
Their expectations are that their parents, their adult caregivers, are going to Google that stuff, and they're going to put in a significant amount of work to support their child. And like, really, that expectation is not unreasonable. I understand time constraints,
right? But like,
that's how you're going to support your young people in your life that identify that way.
Yeah, yeah. And I do hope that young people just think about like, the caregiver is going, like, because they're going on this journey and they are getting educated on these things, they're going to show up with a humility and maybe not know some things they're talking about. Sure. And hopefully they know, just keep that conversation open. But yes, absolutely, to the homework of the caregivers, because again, it is a huge load on LGBTQ youth. And I think that it's just so important for us to be doing our work.
Yeah. And I'm going to just mention PFLAG.
Yes.
PFLAG has chapters throughout the country, and that is parents of LGBTQIA+ young people. So I think that might be a good place for parents to find some support and some education from other parents who have been navigating. Learn what's good, learn what they did that wasn't so good, and help get some support.
Yeah, and a lot of times I have seen like different caregivers as well, like parents, friends, maybe just like educators as well, coming to these so that they can be better allies and supportive.
Absolutely.
In those lives. So, yeah. And so like you mentioned with the runaway homeless youth, like because they're out there and they've run away or been kicked out and they are homeless, they are at high risk for being trafficked.
Yep.
Labor trafficking or sex trafficking.
Yep, because the traffickers prey on vulnerabilities. And now these young people have more layers of vulnerabilities. You know, they already have insecurities, or they're already being bullied, and because they're LGBTQ plus, and then now they don't have a home. Right. Now they need help securing food. They don't have as many adults maybe, or any adults in their world going, this seems shady. Right? Mm-hmm. So now they're at higher risk for those things.
Yeah. Yeah. Which, because of all of this, it's any wonder that there are higher rates of substance use and self-medication, and they're finding ways to cope with all of these stresses now, just because like that is a coping skill. Yeah. It's unhealthy.
Sure. It is not a good
They are finding ways to cope with all of this extra stress, all of this extra load and burden. Mm-hmm. I mean, you can see why.
Well, we've removed the healthy coping skills, or the ability to access, reaching out to your parent or a mentor, or if they're, living on the street, the likelihood is they don't have access to counseling and therapy and support groups. Right. So, yeah, it's
or their medical care, like maybe the hormones they need, or because maybe they were on them and then they're cut off.
Yeah.
We just don't exactly know what any young person is going through at any given time.
We don't. And I think we have a higher homeless population here in like North Central Illinois than I would have expected, in all honesty. And it really hurts my heart when I hear people say nasty things about homeless people, because very few people are living on the street because they don't want to work. It's not about not wanting to work. They may be unable to work for different reasons, but like your 19-year-old you see on the street, like, hustling for money, like, think about it. It's not because they're lazy. It's because we've taken away their opportunity to have security financially.
Yeah.
Yeah. So that being said, they are obviously high risk. And I'm going to say that in quotes. It feels gross to me when I say high risk, because it almost feels like I'm putting that burden on them, or it's their fault that they're at risk. And I want to make it explicitly clear. It is not their fault. It is not LGBTQ's youth's fault for being high risk. It's because of our society, our cultural beliefs, and oppression. Mm-hmm. They are high risk as a consequence of oppression, not as a consequence of their identity. And our current systems, our structures, our institutions are the root causes that harm these young people.
Absolutely. So what can we do about it? There's actually lots we can do to support LGBTQ plus young people. First of all, like we had mentioned that the young people are wanting like their parents and caregivers to do your homework. Reflect on your privilege. What kind of privileges do you walk around with? How do you show up in the world? And what's your gender identity? What is your race? What's your ethnicity? Are you educated? What's your sexual orientation? How are you showing up, and where is that on the privilege oppression spectrum? And really start to think about like your experience is not everybody else's experience. So just starting there and then reflecting on your biases, because no matter who you are, you have biases. Like, you're human. You've got a brain. You've developed these judgments, whether you like it or not. Mm-hmm. And so these are things that you just have to become aware of and then work on them.
Yep. Absolutely. Awareness is that first piece.
Yeah.
Once you know that it's happening, now you can really start doing the work to change that.
Right. And again, the better understanding LGBTQ plus experiences through doing your homework. And one way you can do this is consuming LGBTQ plus media, reading books, whether that's fiction or nonfiction. I prefer fiction, and I do learn a lot.
Yeah.
And TV series, movies,
Podcasts.
Podcasts. I love the shows and books that really focus on the joy. They don't shy away from the challenges that the characters are experiencing, but they really do live into the joy of being who they are, truly.
Absolutely.
So I really, really love that. And then, become an ally. And we are going to be talking about in the next episode how to do that in a good way.
Absolutely. And speaking of how to become an ally, the media we love is actually called Savvy Ally. And that is by Jeannie Gainsbourg. And she calls it a guide to becoming a skilled advocate. And I want to mention that this would be maybe your second step, possibly in your journey, because this is less about basics of like, what is a lesbian? Who does a lesbian like? What do all the LGBTQIA initials stand for? It's more about actionable things you can do in your life to be a better ally and how to speak to people who might challenge your point of view. So it's super duper helpful. Lots of great things that I learned from that book. And we'll absolutely link it in our show notes.
Great. Yes. Thank you so much for sharing that, Heather.
Yeah.
And next episode, we are going to be going into LGBTQ plus terminology and background information so that you can be a better ally. So thank you so much for sticking with us and listening, and keep listening for resources.
Look out for new podcasts every other Monday on anywhere that you can find your podcasts. Spotify, Apple, Stitcher, Anchor FM, you name it. We're there. If you have any questions, and we would love to hear from you, you can email us at saferjourneyspod@safejourneysillinois.org. You can also message us on social media. We have a Facebook and an Instagram that you can find us at. And let's talk about some resources for anyone who's experiencing abuse. If you happen to live in and around LaSalle or Livingston County in Illinois, please feel free to call Safe Journeys support line at 815-673-1555. 24/7, confidential, services are free. If you don't happen to be in our area, there are 2 national hotlines that you can call for support. For sexual violence, you can call RAIN with 2 N's. That's the National Sexual Violence Hotline. Their phone number is 800-656-HOPE. They also have a live chat on their website if you're interested. And for domestic violence or intimate partner abuse, you can call the hotline, which is simply thehotline.org. This is our national domestic violence hotline, and you can give them a call at 800-799-SAFE or chat live on the website. Thanks for listening.